Back in the early 1800s, there was a controversy over Congress and its power to establish a national bank. Alexander Hamilton proposed the bill to establish the national bank, and it was approved in Congress. It was now up to the president to decide if he was going to approve or veto.
George Washington, I'm afraid that a national bank would create a financial monopoly that might undermine state banks and adopt policies that favored financiers and merchants.
George Washington, we need a second national bank to facilitate payments, relieve war debts, and to promote business and industries. The bill for the second bank of the United States.
After this bill's passing, many states recovered taxes on the federal bank as a form of protest, and James McCulloch, a federal cashier at the Baltimore branch, refused to pay these taxes out of protest. He thought it was unconstitutional. After James McCulloch refused to pay his taxes, the state of Maryland took him to court in an attempt to recover these taxes, and the state of Maryland won this court case. However, James McCulloch appealed this case to the Supreme Court, and they decided to take it on. So now that this case actually made it to the Supreme Court, there was a lot of fear in Congress and in the general public that since Congress had no expressed enumerated power to make this bank, that if Congress said they were using their implied powers for it, Congress could use that same logic to essentially do anything they wanted to, and that this would violate limited government, the principle of that. However, members of Congress in favor of creating the national bank often cited the necessary and proper clause, which stated that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Additionally, these members of Congress who supported the bank also argued the bank allows the government to exercise existing powers like the Taxing and Commerce Clause. So with all these debates up in the air, the Supreme Court had the difficult decision in deciding if the states can tax a federal entity, and that relates to the quote by the Chief Justice John Marshall at the time said, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." And the Supreme Court had even the more pressing issue of is the national bank even constitutional? So ultimately, Chief Justice John Marshall and his other fellow members of court made the unanimous decision that Congress could create the national bank and that states could not be authorized to tax the bank. And it is argued that Marshall borrowed heavily from Hamilton's arguments in defense of the bank's constitutionality. Also, Marshall cited the necessary and proper clause when he made his decision. So this court case was incredibly impactful in expanding Congress's powers through the use of the necessary and proper clause, which no longer necessitates the government being stringently bound by the guidelines of the Constitution, and instead more focuses on interpretation by current officials. After this court case, Congress began to use this clause in more ways than one, and serves as a factor in how the national government has slowly expanded power over time. Also, I wanted to cite a similar case called Gibbons versus Ogden, when a New York state law gave a monopoly jurisdiction over certain waters, and Ogden's filed suit against this monopoly, and Chief Justice John Marshall decided, once it made it to Supreme Court, that New York could not give a monopoly these powers, and that they were actually given to Congress under the Commerce Clause. And I thought this was related because both of these cases just deal with the Supreme Court expanding Congress's power through the citation of a broad clause, and also they both deal with the economy and commerce. And then for my article, I just got one from history.com. I thought it was interesting because it discussed the political landscape prior to this case, and it basically said how it was in 1812 was the end of the war, so the government was in a lot of debt and it needed a bank to regulate and stimulate the economy. So that's why they enacted the Second National Bank. But Thomas Jefferson was really afraid that the federal bank would become a financial monopoly, and he feared that it would favor financiers and merchants over farmers, who are usually debtors.
That's all for my presentation. Thank you for watching.